Lena had just moved into her new apartment, an old place with creaky wooden floors and narrow hallways that seemed to stretch longer than they should. The only strange feature was a massive antique mirror that dominated the hallway. The landlord insisted it stay there, saying it was too heavy and fragile to move. On the first night, everything seemed normal, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The apartment was eerily quiet, and shadows clung to the corners of each room like they didn't want to leave. As she passed the mirror on her way to bed, she caught a glimpse of herself. Her reflection lagged. Just for a second, she moved, and a heartbeat later, the reflection followed. She blinked, convinced her tired eyes were playing tricks on her. Shrugging it off, she turned away and climbed into bed. The next night, the air felt colder. There was a chill that lingered in the apartment, even though the heating was on. Lena couldn't explain it, but she found herself avoiding the mirror. Every time she passed by, her skin prickled, and she felt as though someone was watching her. She stood in the bathroom, brushing her teeth, when it happened again. Her reflection didn't just lag, it didn't move at all. Lena turned her head slightly, but her reflection stayed still, staring straight ahead. Heart pounding, she waved her hand in front of the mirror. Her reflection didn't react. And then after a few seconds, it moved, slowly, like it was mocking her, trailing behind her movements. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back from the mirror, her heart racing. Just as she was about to leave the bathroom, her reflection smiled. It was a slow, eerie grin, one that didn't belong on her face. Lena's stomach twisted in fear as she stumbled out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind her. She stood there for a moment, her heart racing in her chest. When she glanced back at the mirror, her reflection was normal again. But she couldn't shake that smile from her mind. That night, Lena draped a blanket over the mirror. She didn't want to see it. She didn't want to take any chances. But as the hours crept by, she started to hear whispers. At first, they were faint, almost like the wind, but they grew louder. "Look at me. Look at me." She tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. But the whispers continued, persistent and growing in volume. They echoed in the dark, seeming to come from the very walls around her. Then, in the dead of night, the whispers stopped. She lay still, her breath shallow, hoping that whatever it was had gone. But then, the blanket over the mirror fell. It didn't flutter down or slide off. It just dropped silently to the floor. Lena stared at it from her bed, frozen in place. The mirror was uncovered now, its surface gleaming in the dim light. With trembling hands, she got up and made her way to the hallway. The mirror stood tall, untouched. She hesitated, then stepped in front of it. Her reflection was there, but it wasn't quite right. It didn't move as she did. It stood still, staring back at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Lena's stomach lurched. Slowly, her reflection raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Lena's real hand didn't move. The reflection's head tilted, slightly off kilter, as if examining her. Lena stepped back, her hands shaking, but the reflection didn't follow. Instead, it smiled again. This time, it wasn't subtle. It was wide, grotesque, teeth showing, too sharp and too many. Lena gasped, stumbling backward. Her reflection mouthed something, words she couldn't hear. And then it slammed its hand against the glass. Hard. The glass cracked. Lena's heart raced as the sound echoed through the apartment. Spiderweb-like cracks spread across the mirror. Her reflection wasn't smiling anymore. It was furious. The figure behind the glass pounded against it, each strike causing the cracks to grow wider. Lena backed away, unable to tear her eyes from the shattering glass. With a final, deafening crash, the mirror exploded. Shards flew across the hallway, and Lena shielded her face from the debris. When she looked up, her reflection wasn't in the mirror anymore. It had stepped out. Standing in front of her was an exact copy of herself, but wrong. Its skin was pale, its eyes black and hollow, and its mouth twisted into a malicious grin that stretched too far across its face. The copy took a step toward her, silent and deliberate. Lena's back hit the wall as she tried to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and sharp. It was no longer just a reflection. It was her, but it wasn't. The last thing Lena saw was her own face twisted in a smile that wasn't hers. The next morning, the apartment was found empty. No signs of struggle, no broken glass. Everything was as it should be, except for the mirror. The mirror stood perfectly intact, as though nothing had happened. And if you look closely, you could see a woman, trapped inside, her eyes wide in terror, forever frozen behind the glass.